Okay, so this is the second in our OER informational sessions for spring 2021, and this is the Why OER session. And so basically I'm going to start the presentation today, and then Jasmine will finish, and we'll kind of, happily take questions and thoughts and ideas along the way. And so the big question is why? Why OER? Why open educational resources? And so kind of the plan for today is as I outlined, but before we get started, we'd really be happy if you would just drop in the chat any questions, any ideas, any fears, anything that makes you nervous, kind of anything related to OER that you might hope for us to address either in the presentation or to talk about afterwards. And then the kind of outline is I'm going to talk about general trends in college outcomes and give you a brief snapshot of why OER is really important to think about using to help support our students. And then Jasmine's going to talk about some of the survey responses that she's received and really address our students' lived experiences. And then we're briefly going to talk about some of the barriers that we understand faculty have to employing OERs. And so remember, OER is basically anything that is free or even reduced price materials or resources for our students, things that help reduce the financial burden associated with completing college. And it's much more than that, but for our purposes, that's kind of what we're going for. And so really what my side of this is about social class and college outcomes. And this is kind of the general trends that we've seen over the last couple of decades. We know that working class students in general are first generation students, which means their parents haven't gone to college, haven't completed a degree, and these students usually come from lower income families. And so nationwide, weekly income differences between someone with a bachelor's degree and a high school diploma turns out to be pretty significant. And over the course of a year, it's more than $22,000. That's important when we're looking at students and thinking about college, especially prices. In terms of academic preparedness, students who live in disadvantaged neighborhoods tend to attend schools that are disadvantaged also. They have less income for like a wide curriculum. The buildings tend to be in disrepair. Teachers are less experienced or they're teaching outside of their area. And all of this leads to students from these disadvantaged neighborhoods having a lower GPA. And this matters in terms of how long it takes to complete college and affects the chances that they'll complete it at all. And so in terms of social class, working class students are less likely to attend college than our middle class students. And when they do attend, it tends to be lower selectivity institutions. Working class students are less likely to graduate, which of course has to do with their lower academic preparation. But the truth is, lower selectivity institutions have lower graduation rates. Students who can get into higher selectivity universities tend to graduate more often. Lower selectivity institutions, not so much. When working class students do graduate, it takes them longer. And this is really important because that's additional time out of like a career-focused labor force. It also means that they have to take out more loans. And then, of course, they have lower returns on their education. And paying for college itself can be difficult because so many students are dependent on financial aid. They have less dependency or less stability of dependency on resources from families. And a lot of the time students have to work off campus. This is problematic because when they're working, 15, 20, 40 hours a week, that's less time they can spend focusing on their academic kind of career. This is also a problem because we know that in terms of student retention, students who make social connections on campus are more likely to persist. But if you have to spend your time working, it's harder to engage in activities on campus. And so all of these forces kind of come together to make it really hard for working class students to complete college. And so, Joelle, that's great, but why does that matter at ESU? Well, it matters because between 2010 and 2015, at least 414 students lived below the poverty line. And that's pretty important. By quintile, there were always more working class students, and by quintile I mean kind of the average income divided up into fifths, and I got this from the Tax Bureau. We had working class students, in the lowest quintile, a lot of working class students in the second lowest quintile, and even all the way through the third. And so that we know that a lot of our students do experience economic disadvantage because, as you'll see in the next slide, more than half of our students are first generation working class students. In terms of finances, ESU has, relatively inexpensive tuition compared to other institutions, but it's not nominal. Tuition still creates a financial burden for students. And this is just kind of a breakdown from the 2019-2020 information about tuition. In-state tuition was about $7,000. Estimated expenses, for the year were about $20,000. Out-of-state tuition, of course, is high, and things like that. What I want to point out, though, is that 98% of all of our students have to have some sort of financial aid. That's really high. I mean, that's really high even compared to other institutions like ours. 38% of these students receive Pell Grants, and that's fine because a grant you don't have to pay back, but then 78% had to take out loans. And this doesn't even show that the allotted books and materials fee or, allotment per semester is $1,000. And so when you look at that in terms of students who live below the poverty line or in these lower economic quintiles, college becomes a real burden, a real financial burden. So during 2010 to 2015, 53% of our students were working class, and this was about 4,400 students. 65% of our working class students dropped out, which was compared to about 57% of the middle class students. The working class average family income, which came from the FAFSA information, was about $62,000, which is pretty average. But the middle class average income was $86,000. And that's a statistically significant difference. Working class mean GPA was about 3.17, and of course middle class GPA was higher at 3.38. And those differences are also statistically significant. For this cohort, the time to graduation was slightly longer for working class students. And these are really just a few of the difference that social class makes and why it's important for our students. And so why should we engage in exploring OER options? Because at ESU, we have mostly working class students, because the average income for those students is lower than it is for our middle class students. Because our students are more likely to need financial aid. They're more likely to have to work off campus, which of course means they lose time studying. And working class students are overwhelmingly more likely to drop out, yet they will still bear the burden of their loans, even if their degree isn't complete. And so exploring and utilizing OER is something that we can do to help our students with their financial burdens that are associated with going to college. And this can honestly help them increase their chances of completion.
All right. Well, thank you, those of you who are joining us today, for this opportunity to have this conversation. And thank you so much to Joelle for inviting me to engage in this conversation as well. So my piece today is going to be talking a little bit about understanding college students' lived experiences. And for me, I'm also going to try to frame OER is part of a larger conversation about exercising a pedagogy of care, specifically. So I want to start with a kind of what brings me into this work. So this quote you see on the screen, "We made the decision to buy my textbooks instead of food," was kind of a turning point for me. I had a student in my office in the fall or in the spring of 2019 who was crying. She had recently married and her family was no longer in the picture because they did not agree with those arrangements. Because of the government shutdown at the time, her financial aid had not come in. They had signed up for SNAP benefits for the first time, and she had felt a lot of shame around that. And she let me know that she and her partner had literally made the choice to buy her textbooks instead of food. To me, this was unacceptable. Our students should not be having to make a choice between textbooks and food. I also learned through that conversation that she was unaware of some of the resources on our campus and our community. So she was unaware of Corky's Cupboard, for example, which I quickly let her know about, and we connected her to those resources. But to me, this was kind of a major catalyst for me to saying, enough is enough and wanting to do more about this. So for those who don't know me as well on the call, I'm an assistant professor of communication here. I am also the co-founder and director of the EAT initiative, which seeks to combat food insecurity both on our campus and in the community. And as an outgrowth of the EAT initiative's efforts, I am also the co-chair of the Basic Needs Coalition here on campus. And so some of the results I'm sharing with you today are part of that coalition's work. I also am one of the first round Craig Grant recipients to insert OER into my classes, specifically my class on small group communication. That's a major course. And so I put together an OER resource on that. So I'm happy to answer folks' questions about what it actually looks like to adopt one of these as part of that process. So I'm going to talk a little bit about understanding these lived experiences, particularly around our students' basic experiences with basic needs insecurity. So how do some of the financial constraints that Joelle just talked about play out in our students' lives? Talk a little bit about exercising a pedagogy of care, and then leading into our conversation about barriers that faculty still face in trying to adopt these kinds of resources. So what do we know about students' real college experiences? So I want to start with a few definitions just to make sure we are all on the same page. So when I say the term basic needs insecurity, I am referring to essential resources that our students need to succeed both inside and outside the classroom. And that includes things like having access to safe, sufficient, and reliable food and housing, but also a whole host of other things like mental and physical health services. As we've seen during the pandemic, technology is part of that conversation. Having access to the internet and functioning devices is a big part of being able to continue your education. Transportation, childcare, and financial resources. Since we're here at Emporia State and we talk a lot about adaptive leadership, I think it's important to note that this is an adaptive challenge. So it's one for which there is not one simple, easy solution, but these are complex issues that we're facing that require a lot of us to come to the table to engage. And OER is one part of this larger conversation. Throughout the presentation, I'll have a few quotes, and these are directly from ESU students. So I want to share that with us today. Amy, can I invite you to share this quote with us to kind of engage those of us in the room today?
I could be in class sometimes just like not even thinking about what the teacher is talking about, wondering what's going on because I'm so hungry and I need some food.
So as a faculty member, this is something now I think about a lot as I hear this comment from my students, and this idea that this is playing out every day in our classrooms, whether we realize it or not, behind the scenes. So a couple other key terms that are important for the presentation today. One, food insecurity. So there we're talking about not just hunger, but also a lack of consistent access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food. So it encompasses a lot of different things beyond just not having food for a time period, being hungry. It also includes things about the type of food we have access to, whether it's a reliable source of food, the stressors that come from not knowing if we're going to have enough money for food. There's a lot that goes into that conversation. Housing insecurity refers to conditions that inhibit a person's ability to have a consistent, safe, and affordable place to live. And so that includes everything from concerns about whether or not you're able to pay your rent or utility bills to homelessness, which is at the other extreme end, which refers to the lack of a fixed, regular, or adequate place to live. And so there we're referring to people not having that kind of stable place to go back and lay your head. Sometimes that results in, looks like couch surfing. It looks like living in a place that's not really meant for habitation and living in your car, for example, for a time period. So the results I'm going to share with you today were recently released as part of the Hope Center's work. So the Hope Center runs the nation's largest annual basic needs assessment among college students, and they've done so for the past 6 years. And so they call it the Real College Survey to get at the real college experience, and basic needs is part of what is covered within that survey. So the most latest version that just came out at the end of March, and ESU participated in that survey. So this year, over 200,000 or nearly 200,000 students from over 200 US colleges and universities participated, and that took place last fall. ESU has participated the last 2 years, which kind of gave us a little bit of a snapshot of both before and after or during COVID times and how that's kind of impacted our students. So in fall 2020, approximately 478 ESU students completed that survey. And so these results are based on that. I want to acknowledge this is, of course, a convenient sample. It was sent out to all students. And so, certain students are more likely to respond to others. And in a year like this one, it's important to note that these could underrepresent the actual need. One, for reasons that Joelle already mentioned, this idea that students who were basic needs insecure, working class students, may not have returned in the fall in the context of the pandemic. So if you were already struggling and then you layer pandemic, job loss, hour loss on top of that, this may be a reflection of students who did not return. Additionally, we might underrepresent it because, if you're someone who's already struggling with digital access, are you going to take an online survey, right? So I just want to acknowledge that. So yes, these numbers are going to seem staggering today, but they might be even higher. So I'm going to compare our results on the screen. You'll be able to see it in comparison to other four-year institutions, but I'm going to talk about ESU's results. So from the survey, we learned that approximately 59% of Emporia State students who were surveyed had experienced at least one form of basic needs insecurity in the prior year. And this was slightly higher than other four-year institutions. When it comes to food insecurity, approximately 30% of ESU students had experienced food insecurity in the 30 days prior to the survey. So just in the past 30 days alone. This is a decrease from our prior year. Yes, that is 59% of respondents. So in that prior year, we actually saw more like 41% of Emporia State students who had participated in that year's survey who had experienced food insecurity. And we believe this drop could be a number of reasons. So one, of course, who takes the survey in the given year. And we can't necessarily, we can compare it to our university demographics and, look for differences in that. But we think it could reflect a positive change in the sense that we've been trying to do more to connect folks to resources. There have also been some additional resources in the context of COVID, like CARES Act funds for students that are temporary and not just specific to right now. But also it could be a negative result in the sense that, that idea of which students returned in the fall. So if we're surveying enrolled students and our students dropped out, then that might be also reflective of that. So we can't know for sure why it dropped, but even I would argue that any amount of our students being food insecure is a problem, and this is still in line with what is found at other four-year institutions. Joelle, can I ask you to read this one?
Absolutely. Access to food is my priority when it comes to paychecks. It can be hard because not as many things are there because of COVID. Less pay, less hours. I have to be smart about what I eat. It makes me angry that as a student, I have to put so many things before food, especially healthy foods. I skip a meal every once in a while. It's fine, but it also gets scary.
Thank you. In terms of housing insecurity, this year's results were higher. So approximately 48% of Emporia State students who completed the survey had experienced housing insecurity in the prior year. Additionally, 16% had experienced conditions consistent with homelessness. In terms of housing insecurity, this was an increase from the prior year, and we think that might be largely attributable to the kinds of housing insecurity that was introduced by campus closures in the spring, where folks suddenly didn't have places to go, and that might be reflected in this increase over the prior year. Jerry, could I invite you to read a quote?
After the breakup, I had nowhere to go, so I had to, and still, couch surf for a while. I'm not in a position to finish out the semester right now.
Thank you. And Susan, would you be willing to read a quote?
Sure. I've had a rough last 2 weeks as the dorms closed and my grandparents are positive. I had to live out of my car for a bit, but now I have stable housing.
Thank you. So obviously these results among those who responded to the survey show that there is a high need. And this is consistent with what's found largely at other four-year institutions across the United States. So we are kind of at or a little higher than other related institutions. Unfortunately, though, the survey also tells us that students aren't necessarily using the resources that we do have available. So of those in the survey who were experiencing basic needs insecurity, only 16% reported using some form of emergency financial aid. And the survey also indicated among those who didn't use campus supports that the reasons range from issues related to stigma, like they felt those supports were needed more by others, they were embarrassed to apply, or quote unquote, people like me do not use programs like that, or also related to lack of knowledge. So not knowing the program existed, not knowing whether or not they qualified for the program, didn't know how to apply for the program. And this tells us that despite our best efforts to communicate some of these resources to students, that we still need to continue to do a better job. Amy, can I toss it back to you for this quote?
I feel like we get forgotten when it comes to food insecurity. I feel like walking into food pantries as a student athlete, people judge me because they think, oh, they can afford it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And so I think this quote is helpful because it speaks into that kind of stigma issue that keeps people from reaching out and seeking resources. Another really important point that I wanted to make to tie into some of what Joelle was saying earlier is basic needs insecurity is not equally experienced across our students. So basic needs insecurity is ultimately an equity issue. So the results consistent with other research of various methodologies found that LGBTQ plus students, students of color, first generation students at ESU, as it was elsewhere, are more likely to report experiences of basic needs insecurity than their peers. Not only that, but they are often less likely to mobilize campus resources. So ESU students who identified as male, as Hispanic or Latinx, Native American, and or LGBTQ+, and who were basic needs insecure were less likely than their peers to utilize campus resources. Joelle, could I ask you to read this one for us?
Absolutely. You don't want to ask anybody for help, or you don't want to feel vulnerable.
This quote comes from a Black male student who talked about feeling that as a man, and in particular as a Black man, he felt like he wasn't in a position to ask for help. He didn't want to play into stereotypes, and he didn't want to be perceived as weak. So what do we do with this information? Knowing this about our students, and what is our responsibility for those of us who work directly with students here on campus, who are administrators, who are community members, who care about these issues. So for me, I think about what it means to teach in this context. And for me, that means exercising a pedagogy of care. And that involves talking about and actively taking steps to address basic needs. It means recognizing that these are equity issues that are differentially impacting our students. It means exercising care, not just in our policies that we might write in our syllabi, but also in our everyday practices with students, remembering that they are whole humans coming into the classroom and that there are lots going on outside of that classroom, outside that door. And also for me, that includes catalyzing institutional change beyond my own classroom, which is related to the kinds of work that I have been doing with the EAT initiative and the Basic Needs Coalition here on campus. For sake of time, I won't talk about those things here today, but I'm happy to share a little bit more with you if you're interested in learning more about those things. We can kind of come back as we have time. I do want to talk a little bit about what some of those specific then practices look like. And for me, one of those is OER. So for me, one of the practices of care, I think, is adopting free and low-cost options for course materials. Is textbooks alone going to solve the problem? No, but I think it's an important step that I can and am enabled to take as a faculty member. So for me, other steps might include things like including a basic needs statement among other hardship statements in my syllabi to make sure students know about these resources and kind of destigmatize it by talking about those resources. The statement in the syllabus gives them an opportunity to read it, but also for me to talk about it on that first day of class. I also make a point of talking about it regularly. So every semester I do about a 5 to 6 week check-in. That tends to be when stuff hits and students tend to start feeling greater anxiety around things, or things have happened with paychecks or not, or financial aid or not, that come into play. And so I use that as kind of an opportunity for students to reflect and to remind them about some of those campus resources. So things like Corky's Cupboard, but also things like our counseling services here on campus. In my classroom, it also looks like providing flexibility through golden tickets that allow students, that kind of unhide the curriculum, that allow students to use them for an extension when they need it. No questions asked. We can negotiate a new deadline or to resubmit an assignment that they might have bombed at a time when they were experiencing a hardship. And so for me, that's one way, because the data actually also shows that students from more privileged backgrounds are more likely to ask for what they need. And this is one way to make that enabled for all students. And so for me, that's a really important step. And then lastly is frankly, actually talking to students about care and compassion, and in particular, self-care and self-compassion as an important part of my pedagogical practice. So again, as I mentioned, I think OER is a key way that we do this. It's one way, but part of a larger, for me, it's part of my larger pedagogy and commitments to my students. And so I want to acknowledge that, yes, it's one part of the conversation, but it's only one piece of it, but it's an important one, and it's one that we can actually take steps on today. So the last thing that Joelle and I wanted to make sure that we had a chance to touch on today is, yes, for us, for some of us, this is kind of our sense of moral obligation to our students, our sense of care for our students, that we want to take this action. We recognize these are equity issues. But there are also some things that still maybe get in the way of our commitments to wanting to maybe even use or move towards OER resources. So some of the ones that we started to identify, so some common reasons that I've at least heard related to why we might not adopt OER can include things like the time and labor involved in creating, adapting, and or adopting OER or similar resources. So especially at a time where for many of us, teaching responsibilities have doubled or tripled in the context of the pandemic. And for people who are also engaged in childcare and other things outside of their duties, among their other responsibilities of research and service, that taking on the task of redesigning a class through new materials is a lot. It feels like a lot. Additionally, for some of us, maybe the availability or quality of OER in particular subject areas. There's some subject areas that are more developed into OER than there are others. Some this might be considered a barrier. And then the other one we identified was resistance that we might find among others, or lack of support from others in taking these steps. So for example, if you're in a department where there's a GE course taught where there's a requirement or kind of an agreement that you use the same textbook over the series of courses, then your decision alone might not be enough because you're reliant on other people having to take that step too. So these are some of the ones that we identified and wanted to provide some suggestions of how we combat this, but we wanted to open it up for a moment to you all in terms of, are there other common reasons for not adopting OER that you feel like you either personally experienced or have heard from others?
That's what I'm looking at this list and I'm thinking this kind of covers a lot of it. There's an aesthetic of resistance, which is the overwhelm that we all feel, right? And I think what I hear the most is all the reasons why the resources are insufficient, the technology is insufficient, the library is insufficient. So looking for insufficiencies before you even start is going to shut you down. I don't care what you're doing, OERs or anything else. But I think that's a mindset that I hear a lot is, well, I can't possibly do this unless everything is perfect and all the resources are out there. So it's a kind of Eden or apocalypse binary in the thinking of people who are really resistant to this. And I'm sure that manifests in other areas than OERs, but everything that you've listed here is part of that thinking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. So as Joelle, is there anything else you wanted to add about these common reasons before we transition to some of our solutions?
No, but I really like Amy's Eden and apocalypse binary. That one's particularly resonant. And I had to write that one down because, man, in terms of binaries, that's about as cohesive as you can get and concise.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it captures a lot of this OER conversation. You have people who are very strong advocates of it, and then of course those who are like, it's going to bring the end to all things, right? Or it's going to challenge us in these ways. And one of the things I hope we can do in this next part of the conversation is be realistic about the conversation about OER, but also speak to some of the resources that are possible. One thing I wanted to note real quick on this slide is you see that I have a little asterisk by OER. And that's in part because I know from the previous conversation that was had in the part one of this series of workshops is kind of this definition around OER. And I wanted to note that at least for my sake, I take a very open or broad definition of that term where we're talking about free or reduced cost options for students. Oh yeah, Amy.
I wanted to mention the technology piece of this, and I think that we all feel like we're spending so much time doing everything but what is essential, mm-hmm. right? That we're spending all the time upgrading the technology, changing the ways we do things rather than what is most meaningful, what got us into these professions in the first place. Now, what just happened to us in 2020 when we all had to be on Canvas, if you weren't already, you had to be, right? And so maybe it's a little bit less scary. I think sometimes what is so difficult about OER is that it seems like, oh great, another thing that I have to be good at, that I have to master, that is all about tech, that is going to go out of date, things I have to upgrade, things I don't have support for, right? So it's that feeling of futility that I think we're all facing. And if there was kind of a low stakes way to get into it, as you're mentioning, that it doesn't have to be all or nothing, right? You could start in a low stakes way. I think more people would be open to it. And certainly I have that same kind of resistance sometimes. I just go, oh, you're kidding me. You what? Right?
Yeah. Thank you so much. I think that's a really important point about this kind of newness being part of it, right? There's some anxiety around the uncertainty of trying to do something that's new or things that are newer to us. So I think part of what Joelle and I wanted to offer in response to some of these concerns is to recognize that we have an emerging ecosystem of support on OER. So certainly there's some resources that are not perfect. There could always be more resources that would enable this work, but we wanted to highlight a couple that we think are really important and have supported us in our efforts to adopt OER. So first, there's some important networks of support here on campus. So we have fellow faculty and staff members here on campus who are already doing some of this work. And for those who are newer to it, that we can have the opportunity to share resources, mentor each other, talk about the challenges that we've combated, do things like this session here today to share some of those challenges and difficulties. And that includes that we have an Oer Task Force that's, acting to work on some of these issues on a variety of levels, whether that is kind of mentoring and outreach, resources related to it that we can develop for faculty, among others. We also have some really fantastic librarians here on campus who are helpful in connecting us with different databases for OER resources, access to different resources that they can connect us to, help with copyright questions and those sorts of things that can come up when we're engaging with OER. And then we wanted to point out the really important thing about colleagues at other institutions. So I have found personally, and I can speak from my own experience, adapting and creating an OER text for my small group communication class, that when I started this process, I found it daunting too. In my field, there are far yet less OER resources that are out there and available. But I had the fortune of getting connected with a colleague at K-State who had taken this journey the year before me. And I have found that others in the OER space, given the spirit of OER, which is about having open and free resources, tend to be really giving of their work and their energy. And so he and I had a lot of conversations as I was working on mine. I used some of the things that he had developed. He has now since used some of the things that I have developed. And we are having conversations about how we can bring others to the table to continue to develop further resources. And so I have found at least a desire among those who begin using OER or related resources to support each other in those efforts, to share the resources that they're doing, but also to recognize their constraints and find creative ways to respond to some of those constraints, at least in my own field. And then additionally, we want to recognize there's some other resources that can support these efforts. So certainly there have been some grants like the Craig grants that have been available, and we hope that they may still continue to be available in the future or things like it. There are a variety of trainings and workshops available like the one we are sitting in right now, engaged in, but also KBOR has offered a range, and those webinars, many of those webinars are available to watch, have been recorded. Again, this idea of trying to share with more people and make this information more accessible to others. And there's a variety of OER websites and hubs that have been available that collect some of this stuff, so we don't have to hunt for it quite to the same degree. So I think these things kind of collectively represent this emerging ecosystem of support for moving toward OER resources. I say emerging in the sense that it's not a perfect ecosystem. There could always be more that speak to it, but I think these are some important resources that we have at our disposal to answer these questions about time and labor, something feeling new to us, and having things at our disposal. So I'd like to invite Joelle to share, to add on to that, anything I might have missed and anything she wants to add to our kind of response to some of those major barriers.
Thank you, Jasmine. I think you actually did a really fantastic job. And I was thinking, oh my gosh, from our conversation yesterday, you made this great ecosystem. And I'm both humbled and pleased that you are drawing this together. I don't really have a lot to add. I mean, you were very thorough and comprehensive. My kind of next vein of thought really has to do with how do we move from knowing all of these things to kind of affecting that mindset of resistance, kind of that Amy was addressing. And that was kind of the purpose of, yes, please.
This is maybe a slightly new point in terms of that resistance and some things that we need to address. And it's some of the factors about academic culture itself that mitigate against the kind of openness and collaboration that Jasmine is talking about. That, for one thing, if you're a textbook author, you make quite a bit of money. That is the only place that anybody makes any money in publishing is textbooks. Reviewing textbooks, etc. There's always been more money in that, and I think people who came up in that system have become part of that culture. The idea of intellectual property, sharing and protecting intellectual property, being proud of pedagogy, etc., is deeply ingrained in us, a very protective stance, right? And then there's the matriculation toward tenure and promotion. So how can the institution and its practices and some of the ways that we acknowledge each other's accomplishments and labor begin to change at department and program levels to remove some of those barriers ideologically and functionally for us? You know what I'm saying?
Absolutely. I mean, I feel so bad because I mean, it seems like it all goes back to money in one way or the other, whether, it be from the student side or part of the faculty resistance. And you were talking about kind of the
job
culture
security.
of, I'm sorry?
And job security. I mean, you have to earn tenure.
Yeah.
And that is a scary thought that haunts at least 6 years of a lot of people's lives. And it's not just over at that point. The culture of endless striving and the moving of the cheese is part of academic life, right? Post-tenure review, this constantly giving you benchmarks that you're supposed to achieve. And one of the ways that we have set to measure that is publications, lines on the vita, things that you own. And so that burden of the full-time tenure line faculty is part of the institution itself,
It seems to me then there's a piece too about, educating our colleagues about OER resources. I have found myself, openly talking about that on my, retention documents that I have to submit as a pre-tenure faculty member. And I think there's ways that it can still show up in productive ways within that process that we're talking about. So I put the OER resource that I created on my CV, right? I talked about it in my retention documents, being able to say that I got the Craig grant, especially at a place like ESU that values the teaching in addition to the research. That's a piece that I feel like I can hold up to say, not only am I doing this, but I'm being recognized by others at the university for doing so, and can speak to those resources. And then the other thing that allows me to do is, for example, this textbook that I've adopted, other people at other universities are starting to adopt. And so that allows me to then report and say, in the same way that someone could if they wrote a textbook that's being sold, ultimately, that, people at other places are using it, to be able to name some of those places. And then there are, and I haven't had the chance, and I'm hoping to this summer get a little bit more into this, that some of these hubs that I mentioned that are online, they are doing things like reviewing books and giving ratings and comments and feedback to authors in a way that is similar to how we might review books that come out of traditional publishers. So I think there's some movement towards that, but I do think it requires educating our colleagues about this too, and its importance, and then finding ways to recognize the labor.
That's a really good point about the citizenship that we can perform by being reviewers to support this kind of work. That holy trinity of teaching, scholarship, and service is a set of categories that has always been somewhat problematic, and I think women in particular are expected to do a lot of the heavy lifting of service and nurturing and accessibility, and have the challenge ideologically in the perception of colleagues, et cetera, not in every department, of not being the scholars, right? And so anything that moves, if you're already feeling like you're classified as a heavy service person or a heavy teaching person, anything that hews away from the sort of pure scholarly line is a challenge. And, the degree to which, well, I'll just leave it at that. You know what I'm talking about.
So Thank you, Amy, because I think that we do. I think that we need to understand the ways in which OERs can fit into that, holy trinity of the teaching, scholarship, and service. And Jasmine, thank you so much, because that's inspiring. That is, understanding that, you are finding ways to integrate this into your professional kind of promotion, file, I think can really benefit, faculty who may be reluctant, who don't want to invest that time because they feel it might be more beneficial elsewhere. But that takes me back to my general question. So we have some people who have attended today. We've had some people attend on, our last session. How do we make the information that we have not necessarily accessible, because we have lots of access, right? We can find, as faculty, we can find this information. How do we make a substantial difference in getting faculty to understand that, how do we address ways to combat the Eden apocalypse mindset? How do we, without having to go individually, talk to people about it? Because we're giving opportunities. We do this with our students all the time, right? We give them the chance. We have office hours and then they don't come. And I kind of feel like we might have a replication of that with OERs. So what do we do to help faculty be less scared? Because especially because of that fear of failure. Amy, I heard you mention that several times. And especially for new faculty, I can understand that fear of failure because I've realized that I've been doing this for like 14 years now. And I no longer really worry so much about those moments of failure. So how do we help people, though, who are just now beginning or actually have, investments? How do we help them overcome these fears and trepidations about OER?
I have actually, and I'd be curious, and I haven't looked at research that speaks to trajectories of OER. I have found it to be more common among junior colleagues to be having the conversation around OER and adopting it or being open to those resources than some of my colleagues who are more senior in the university, who maybe have been using the same set of materials for a long time. And I think there's different stakes or different, maybe even comfortability if we talk about the technology that's involved or something that's new. Maybe we heard about OER in grad school or other kinds of places before we even came to ESU, so that conversation's maybe not as new to people who are newer to the institution. And so I think that might be a piece of it from what I've observed. I can give the example in my department that one person opening the door sometimes opens it for others. So some of us can have the opportunity to lead by example in our department. So I applied for the original Craig grant and did it for my small group class. And as a result, was able with some colleagues to raise the issue with regards to our GE text for public speaking. And as a result, our colleagues got together in the department. We had some of these same conversations about the labor and time, and is this the right time in the midst of the pandemic to make this switch? But also in senses it was, because we know the financial constraints for our students are even more so. And so we were able to collectively, as a department, all of us who teach the public speaking class, which is almost all of us, to collectively apply for a Craig grant this year to be able to adapt an OER text to use across all the sections of public speaking. And so I think one of us doing it then opens the door for others to be like, oh, that worked. That was okay. And then to have people have the knowledge that there are some of us who had that knowledge of going through that process that can help guide others. So that's one example. And obviously that doesn't spread it across quickly, the university. I think there's other incentives that probably need to continue. So seeing things like the Craig grant continue are probably really important for some folks, it's the incentive that might ultimately drive us there in addition to the moral arguments that we've been making today.
The assumption of scarcity that I think is so prevalent, not just for us, but socially, that there are dwindling resources and greater competition for them, right, is offset a little bit by the prestige of grants, the money of grants, et cetera. But also what I hear you saying is the willingness to act experimentally, to try something without it necessarily needing to be an answer, right? That all of your colleagues got together and said, we're going to roll this out and then we're going to talk with each other and see how it went. That's kind of an energizing practice, isn't it? That seems like a great way to get more of this happening, is to say, what could we experiment with as a group, maybe not even a whole class, but a portion of a class, and see where we are in a semester or a year, right?
Yeah, and we have the fortune, of course, in this case, you know, in the previous class, I'm the only one who teaches that, so I was in that myself. In addition to colleagues I found support elsewhere, and a student who also was part of that project. But I think for this upcoming, you know, project, the nice thing is that, yes, we're each individually going to have to reinsert a new textbook into our classes. But in terms of creating and adapting a text specifically for our ESU students, that labor then doesn't fall on one person's shoulders, right? We can share some of that labor. And yes, I mean, some folks might be doing more or less than others, but ultimately that's not falling on the weight of just one person, because we are able to rely on each other, draw on each other's different expertises and putting this together. And so it feels like maybe less work than it would if I was doing it solo.
You used press books too, didn't you? I think I heard that from Bethany. And that does a lot of the accessibility component too, which I think is a fascinating piece of this that we haven't talked about, that sometimes is a way to innovation, is that maybe you think you don't want to talk about OERs, but you do want to talk about accessibility, right? And so what could we try in a class to make one unit available, right?
Yeah. For those who aren't familiar, Pressbooks is a really awesome platform for OER resources because it makes it available. It's very user-friendly. It feels kind of like a learning management system for those who've used Canvas. There's a lot of things that felt very familiar if you've blogged before or worked on a website before. And it makes you content available in multiple formats. So not only is there a web version that's searchable, available to my student and hyperlinked in between and automatically generates a glossary for me, but it also is available in multiple e-reader formats. You can download a PDF of it to make it available to students that way. And I was able to connect with our University Copy Center to talk about what it looks like for students who do really want that physical copy. And they're able to print it at cost and spiral bound it for under $10 for the book. So even those who might want a physical copy, like they're paying it at cost. I get no cut of that. That's just the cost of like copying it. And that's if you want to get it spiral bound. I think it was like not even $7 in total for that. So that's one of the things I like about the platform. It doesn't require me to then figure out how do I make it available in all these different formats. It does some of that work for me.
See, even if you weren't into OERs, if you knew that you could use something like Canvas or something new, and all the things that it could do for you are kind of exciting, right? And so maybe that's a way that more people would be excited about it if it was like, hey, here's this gift, all these cool things, rather than here's a thing for you to do.
As I see our hour is quickly approaching its closure, I want to mention, Jasmine, I loved when you were talking about kind of engaging faculty. Basically, you were talking about leadership by modeling. And I think that that is terrific. And even though you said that, you know, that doesn't necessarily cover a lot of people on campus at a time, it really could. If we had one person, you know, in a department, or, you know, I think something like that could be really change making. I don't know. That's close to what I mean. But I appreciate that. And I love that your department has like gotten together and they're like, yeah, let's try it. I think that's pretty fantastic.
You know, Jasmine, some of the things that you listed as reasons why people didn't take advantage of services, seem like the same challenges that we have. People like me don't ask for help. Other people are better candidates than I am, that there's, who could you reach out to for help, that kind of stuff. So even that concept of there being a support network and how to make use of it could be helpful information to get out and maybe in some new ways on different frequencies. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. The same issues of either stigma and asking for help or not knowing about the resources are probably some of the same battles we're fighting on the faculty front as well, and encourages us to get creative in the ways that we share out about these resources.
Thank you for that link.
This was so helpful. Thank you.
Yes, that's definitely something that would fit nicely in a basic needs statement or other hardship statements in our syllabi.
Yeah, and for those who are watching the recording, I dropped in the chat information about a new website that the Basic Needs Coalition has created. It's just emporia.edu/basic needs. And you can find, that's a great place to point students in the direction of. We've tried to create a one-stop shop for basic needs related resources. So that includes for food, housing, financial resources. And then there's also a support students page, and that's where you can learn more about things that as faculty, staff, or community members we can do to support students as well. So thank you, Joelle, so much for the invitation and for organizing these sessions. I hope it's been helpful for those who are able to attend today. And thank you so much for taking time out to listen to us today as well.
Yes. Thank you so much, and we will see you next time. Thank you.